So Todd is going to start off with contextualizing state building.
So we're going to talk about absolutism and how, you think about what's going on is that the church has been the authority. And so now it's like monarchs are trying to wrestle back some of that authority, political authority throughout Europe. So in the context of war and economic depression, these monarchs began to make new demands on their people. France, Spain, Central Europe, Russia attempt to centralize authority through these monarchs. Whereas now England and the Dutch Republic, they utilize more constitutional governments to move their societies forward. So when we talk about constitutionalism, when Katie talks about that, you're going to see it's a little bit different. So both absolutist and constitutional governments face these similar obstacles. How do we centralize authority to achieving their goals? But they achieve new levels of control in 4 areas: greater taxation, growth in armed forces, larger and more efficient bureaucracies to collect those taxes, and then to compel obedience from subjects. So the first monarch we're going to talk about as we get into these different absolutist approaches to power. So the objective is explain how these forms of rule affected the social and political development in that time period. And we're going to talk about Louis XIV, and we're going to talk about Peter the Great. These are the 2 monarchs that we'll unpack. Again, we can't go undo the entire unit. So these are the 2 we're highlighting. We'll go to the next slide. And we'll start with this amazing portrait of Louis XIV. And Katie, I have tried to pull off that outfit and I just do not have the legs for it, but he certainly did. So we'll talk about Louis XIV. He comes to the throne at the age of 4 or 5, as Katie mentioned in the opening. And Richelieu then is the minister of the crown on behalf of Louis XIII before we get to Louis XIV. Richelieu is going to enact policies to strengthen and begin centralizing control. And he's going to suppress these different aspects of Protestantism in the land through the use of intendants, which are these officials who are appointed by the monarchs. So if you could think of each state in our union has a governor through an elected process, but Richelieu is creating like these intendants who serve in that capacity, but they're appointed and they report only to the king. So the bullet 2 is Louis XIV. He becomes the king. His mother, Anne, is the regent, along with Mazarin, his chief minister. And so they continue Richelieu's centralizing policies, but his desire to increase royal revenues will lead to a series of rebellions known as the Fronde, because to increase revenues really is just language for we're going to tax people so we have money coming in. Louis does believe in this idea of the divine right of kings, and he acquires the title of Sun King, emphasizing his central role in that divine order. And then there is a group in France called the Estates General. And when we talk about the French Revolution later, we will mention the Estates General. He will never call the States General during his reign, because to do that would demonstrate that they have some authority and some power. And if you're absolute, you never give away your power. He's also going to revoke the Edict of Nantes, which is the edict that was put forth by Henry IV, which allows some Huguenot worship throughout the lands. He demands that Huguenots renounce their faith. He calls for the destruction of Huguenot churches and the closing of Huguenot schools. Because of this, there will be over 200,000 Huguenots who will flee France. Many of them are skilled artisans, and that has an impact, a detrimental impact on the economy at a time when France is really looking for revenue. So we'll move to Versailles, this painting. It's kind of a famous painting of Versailles, and I've always kind of questioned it because the artist, I've been to Versailles and I don't remember mountains in the foreground, in the background back there, but that's something the artist is kind of drawn to draw our eye into it. But we can start ahead and start building the slides here. In 1682, Louis is going to move his court to the newly renovated Palace of Versailles. It was actually his father's hunting lodge. So, that's what everyone's hunting lodge should look like, of course. The king used the palace to curtail the power of the nobility, and he required them at different times of the year to stay and live at Versailles, in part so he could spy on them, but in part so they always knew that he was the king and they were lesser than that. He established this elaborate set of court rituals, all of his daily routines, waking in the morning, dressing, retiring for bed, and everybody's got to pay attention to him. The next bullet talks about how it becomes the center of European politics and French culture. French will place Latin as the language of scholarship and learning. It's the language of diplomacy. It was common to hear French language spoken in the the courts of other countries. Actually, it becomes that kind of central to what Europe is doing. France's economy flourishes in part because the Minister of Finance at this time is Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He believes that the economy should serve the state, and we have this economic idea of mercantilism, where we're going to capture everything we can to serve the state and the state's ends. Our next absolutist monarch is Peter the Great. I will do this rather quickly. Peter was primarily interested in military power, determined to redress the defeats of the Tsar's armies. He had suffered in the wars with Poland and Sweden since the time of Ivan the Terrible. There's a really great image there too, depicting Peter the Great, showing the plans for the building of St. Petersburg. So Peter the Great is like, well, you have Versailles, but I'm going to have a whole city named after me. Territorial expansion is what you have to do if you want to have title the Great, and he will only know 1 year of peace in his 36 years of rule. But all of that war making and territorial expansion really eats into the state's revenues. 80 to 85% of revenue coming into the state was feeding the war machine that he kept putting forward to try and expand territory. So as a consequence of all of his war making, there is an influx of Westerners and Western ideas that come into Russia, and a new class of Russians began to emerge. And it does bring Russia into much more modern, if you will, period of time where it had not had kind of achieved that status before. His reforms include a more army and a state that was introduced to Western civilization. He's going to pave the way to move Russia closer to the European mainstream during the Enlightenment, when the reign of Catherine the Great takes over.
Okay, so now we're going to shift over to England. And pretty much I'm going to touch on, but not go into depth, because as Todd said, we can't cover everything. The learning objective and the historical developments that you see. So we're going to talk a little bit about the causes and consequences. We're going to talk about the English Civil War, and we're going to talk about after the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. So to kind of start off, we're going to contextualize. And as we move from in 1603, the Tudor family with Elizabeth I, the much loved Queen of England, she dies without a child. And she's incredibly popular, but she has no heir. So the throne is going to shift from the Tudor family to the Stuart family of Scotland. And King James I will step into the role of monarch. He is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, that I'm sure you probably remember from earlier in the course. And like Louis XIV, he believes in the divine right of kings. He believes that his power to rule comes from God. And he doesn't necessarily want to share his power. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. He believes that the power comes directly from God, and that nobody, including Parliament, should be able to interfere with that. So religion is also going to play a role in the English Civil War, because we're going to have Calvinist Puritans. And I'm guessing that you've heard that word Puritan before, that name. And they are going to seek to further the English Reformation by removing elements or purifying the elements that in the Anglican Church that are still Catholic. They wanted a much more complete Reformation and weren't happy with the Anglican Church that was created by Henry VIII. They don't like the hierarchy of bishops. And in fact, James I kind of sums up his idea by saying, no bishop, no king. And by that, he means that the enforcement of the bishop's authority in religion was really important for staying in power. He thought if someone didn't respect authority in church, they weren't going to respect his authority. So both James I and his son Charles I had really big problems with Parliament. And so I want you to see this as we are actually contextualizing the English Civil War. We are looking at the problems that are provoked by these two kings that are going to provoke the Civil War to happen in England. So Parliament held the power to tax. And that's really important, because neither James nor Charles wanted the Parliament to have that power, but that's something the Tudors had pretty well established. Charles avoided hearing grievances by simply refusing to call Parliament, and he didn't from 1629 to 1640. During this time, he did a little creative fundraising. There was a tax that was already on the books. It was called ship money, and it was for coastal cities in England to provide ships during time of war for defense. So he levied this ship money during peacetime. And then he extended it not only to the counties that were on the coast, but to inland counties. without the approval of Parliament. So a little creative fundraising for Charles I, that's ship money. Also, when Scottish Calvinists revolted, he's forced to call Parliament to get funds for his war. So the Long Parliament actually was there for 20 years, from 1640 to 1660. And it immediately wanted stuff now that it's been called. It enacted legislation to limit the power of the monarch. It passed the Triennial Act, which said that it had to be called at least once every 3 years. And during a failed attempt of the king to arrest MPs or members of Parliament, Charles I left to raise an army, and in response, Parliament raised its own army called the New Model Army. So we're setting up the civil war that's about to happen. This army is under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, and he is a devout Puritan. So we're seeing this unfold not only as a political struggle, but also as a struggle between two Protestant groups, the Anglican king and the Puritan Parliament. So the English Civil War ensued, and in 1647, the New Model Army captured the king, kicked out members of Parliament that did not support Oliver Cromwell, and put the king on trial. In 1649, the king is found guilty. He's found guilty of high treason by this rump Parliament, and on January 30th of that year, he is beheaded. And if you have a look at the image on the right, that's a painting of Cromwell viewing the body of Charles I. After his death, the monarchy is abolished, and a Republican government is installed called the Protectorate with Oliver Cromwell, leading this as essentially a military dictator. And he will call himself Lord Protector. So this is a very Puritan regime under Cromwell. If you remember yesterday when Todd was talking about Calvinists on our first video on Monday, he was talking about how sort of strict that society is, and it's no different under Cromwell in England. He's banning sports, closing theaters, censoring the press. He does extend religious toleration to all the groups except for Catholics, and he welcomes the immigration of Jews. Cromwell dies in 1658, and by 1660, this period of no monarchy that's called the interregnum is going to be over because the English are ready to bring back the monarchy. So the restoration of the monarchy is going to be the son of Charles I, Charles II, who had been living in the Netherlands. Both houses of Parliament and the Anglican Church were also restored in England. The Test Act was passed, and this would ensure that only Anglicans would hold public office and that the Puritans and Catholics would be stripped of many rights. Parliament refused to give Charles II enough of an allowance, so he formed a secret alliance with Louis XIV, who Todd just spoke about. And with this alliance, he promised to gradually bring Catholicism back to England and to also convert. He did actually convert on his deathbed. When he died, James II, his brother, becomes the king, and James is Catholic. And this is just not going to work for Parliament. This is going to prove to be unacceptable. It becomes really unacceptable when James II has a son who's going to be raised Catholic. So Parliament then offers the throne to the daughter of James II, whose name is Mary, and her husband, William of Orange from the Netherlands. James II and his wife and son flee to France, and William and Mary are crowned jointly as monarchs in December of 1688. So this is the Glorious Revolution. It's a change without bloodshed in England from James II to William and Mary. And even more importantly, the next year in 1689, we are going to shift the power in England forever from the monarch to Parliament, because in 1689, the English Bill of Rights is going to ensure the supremacy of Parliament with a constitutional monarchy. So Parliament will be the one to make the laws. Parliament will have to be called at least once every 3 years. There will be an independent judiciary that's established. It will be illegal to have a standing army in peacetime. And part of one of the provisions of the English Bill of Rights is that only a Protestant can inherit the throne. So this is a really important part of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, because we now have constitutionalism that is going to have the supremacy in a body that's ruled by the people. So that's a huge shift. All right, so let's review.